Erev Tov, good evening, good afternoon to those of you in the US. We are continuing an introduction of Rabbi Shemtob Gaguine. Today's shiur, and I hope to cover all of it in today's shiur, so we'll be doing a lot of Hebrew text today, will be familiar to anybody who studied with me for any significant amount of time. And even if you have not studied with me for a significant amount of time, if you have been to my UK series of shiurim on Maran and accepting the rulings of Maran and Shulchan Aruch, so this will really be a summary of those shiurim, though a little bit different. As with Rabbi Shemtob Gaguine, everything in his world is a little bit different. And so this piece, as much as it may be a review for some of us, is crucial to understanding where Rabbi Shemtob Gaguine is going to go with this narrative of Maran, the author of the Shulchan Aruch, Rabbi Yosef Karo, and the Rama, Rabbi Moshe Yisraelish, the author of the Mapa, the commentary on the Shulchan Aruch. And he needs to set this stage for us, for everything he's going to present to us afterwards. So before we can go any further, if we have discussed lack of unity, discord, infighting in the Jewish community, different episodes throughout history of Jews disagreeing with each other, splitting apart from each other, Rabbi Shemtob Gaguine eventually is going to try and suggest for us a vision for the future. In order to do that, he has to focus on an episode in which unity was attempted. And I'll argue that this unity, as I titled today's shiur, is unity through conformity. Maran, Rabbi Yosef Karo, author of the Shulchan Aruch, trying to get the Jewish people to conform. Conformity, I know in the modern mind, it brings about negative connotations, but it's not always a negative thing to conform to something. Perhaps I could get in trouble for saying that today. But in the world of conformity would mean, let's agree on something. That's essentially what Maran would be suggesting. Let's agree on a path of halakha that the Jewish people can all get behind and go forward. And that's exactly what Rabbi Shemtob Gaguine is going to focus on today. So on page 11 of your PDF, 13 of the Roman numerals, like what he said last week, let's continue. We'll repeat the last sentence he said last week. After suggesting to us Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Chayes' attitude that Sephardim and Ashkenazim are pretty much identical with minor differences, he argues, אבל אין דעתי נוחה מדברי הגאון כאשר תראה להלן ממה שאספתי איזה מנהגים שאין שוויון ביניהם והם כרחוק מזרח ממערב. He said, and I don't agree with Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Chayes, because it can't be that Sephardim and Ashkenazim are identical to each other, or even so similar, because I'm going to show you a collection of minhagim in which Sephardim and Ashkenazim differ as far as east and west from each other. Ma hayta asiba? What was the reason? Shemaran ha-Bet Yosef, that Maran, the Bet Yosef, and you should know when Sephardim of yesterday said the word Maran, Maran only refers to one person. When you say Maran, that's Rabbi Yosef Karo. There is no other Maran. There's no Maran this one, Maran that one. In today's Sephardic world, already Maran means Rabbi Bar Yosef. Rabbi Bar Yosef called the Chidam Maran, Maran the Ben Ish Chai, Maran this one, Maran that one. Maran is Maran. That's all. We have one Maran. And it's important to know that, not because I wish to make Maran the ultimate leader for everyone, but when you read a Sephardic text and it doesn't quote somebody's name, it just says Maran, this is who it's referring to. Ma hayta asiba shemaran ha-Bet Yosef. What was the reason that Maran, the author of the Bet Yosef, nit'orer lechaber chiburav ha-Bet Yosef al-Atur? Why did he suddenly feel the need to compose his work, Bet Yosef, which is a commentary on the existing legal code of the Tur? And then he wrote his own book called the Shulchan Aruch. Meaning, what was the purpose of writing a Bet Yosef, which is a commentary on the Tur, and then writing a Shulchan Aruch? What was Maran's purpose? Hamayen ba'akdamotav la-Bet Yosef va-Shulchan Aruch. Anybody who looks at the introductions of Maran to his Bet Yosef and his Shulchan Aruch, let's just quickly differentiate. What is the Bet Yosef and what is the Shulchan Aruch? Just simple terms, let's define them. How are they different? Tell me.
Bet Yosef is on the Torah.
Right. What does it do on the Torah?
It equates brings together it gives halacha psuka bringing together the Arba Turim.
That's the Shulchan Aruch. Right? So the Bet Yosef is a commentary on the two, and he's showing you all the sources. The ways it brings together. You bring together all the sources, the Mishnayot and the Gemarot and the Rambam and the Rif and the Rosh and whatever else he wants to quote. And then in the Shulchan Aruch, it's just a book of bottom line conclusions. There's no conversation there. It's just, it's a Shulchan Aruch. It's literally a set table. You just go, take what you need, and you walk away from there. No actual legal conversation. Hamayen Bagdamotav. So someone who looks at the introductions, and therefore there are two different introductions, there are two different types of books. La Bet Yosef HaShulchan Aruch. Yavin ve'ida, will be clear to them, shekol magamato u'ma'avayav haya lasim ketz v'tachlit la'pirud hadati. The whole purpose, the driving force behind Maran was lasim ketz, to put an end la'pirud hadati, to the religious separation. Religion is causing Jewish people to be separate from each other. And Maran wished to solve this problem of disunity by suggesting his Shulchan Aruch. V'ratza lekarev harechokim lo bizroa, and he wanted to bring together the rechokim. This is not referring to kiruv as you might use the word today. Kiruv rechokim here, he means bringing close the extremes. So there are extremes. Maran is trying to bring the extremes closer to each other. He's trying to bridge a gap between extremes. Lo bizroa, not with force. V'la'ached ha'umah leguf echad, and he wanted to unite these two extremes of the nation into one body, one cohesive unit. Ve'atik lefanecha tamtzit devarav, and I'll copy for you briefly his words, Maran and Shulchan Aruch's words. So really the purpose of Maran and Shulchan Aruch is to put an end to religious separation, not by force, but by suggesting an alternative the Jewish people can get behind. And there's a few things here that are going on. One is that there are extremes, whether you like it or not. There are extremes in the Jewish community. Now today, I'm pretty sure if Maran was trying to unite two opposite extremes, today you're trying to unite 2,000 opposite extremes. That's already a different problem that we have, that you need a couple of Marans to figure out. But what Maran is dealing with, perhaps, and I'm just going to perhaps, there are Sephardim and there are Ashkenazim, and they both view the legal code of the Talmud through different lenses. Some through Chachamei Sfarad, some through Chachamei Ashkenaz. Now let's be fair, like I was in my class at the Chavura, and that is that among the Sfaradim themselves, there already was disparity between community and community. Which communities were of the northern Sephardim and the southern Sephardim today? That might be similar in your minds. It's not true then, but now the eastern Sephardim and the western Sephardim, and in and of these groups, there were subgroups already that were arguing about details on halakha. And Maran says, I cannot force people. He's not a Sanhedrin. He doesn't have the power to force people, and is not looking to force people, but suggesting an alternative to how people can learn halakha, so the Jewish people can get behind one book. And let's look on the next page. Nosach Hakdamat Maran L'Chiburo HaGadol Bet Yosef. And this is an excerpt with a lot of dots. So Rabbi Shemtob Gaguine is omitting many areas that he doesn't feel are relevant for us. This is the introduction of Maran to his book, the Bet Yosef. Vayhi ki archu lanu hayamim, says Maran, because our exile has lasted so long, horaknu mikeli el keli v'pizur halachnu v'kama tzorot tzorot. We've gone from bad thing to bad thing. We went from exile to exile. We're separated, and so much suffering has befallen us. Ba'u aleinu azat yad haTorah shna'aset lo kishte torot. He said it's not anymore a problem like in the times of the Talmud, where our rabbis were concerned of one Torah becoming shte Torot, becoming two Torot. Rather, ela ketorot en mispar. We have an innumerable amount of Torot. There are so many Torot, it's not just two. L'sibat rov hasfarim. And who's to blame for that? The abundance of Jewish books that exist. There are too many Jewish books. Nobody knows where to learn halakha from anymore. Nobody knows which books are authoritative and which ones are not. No one knows, and this has caused us to be separated. Biviyu mishpateha v'dineha, all these books of halakha which are trying to clarify and elucidate the laws of the Jewish people. Al-ken, and therefore, ani hadal be'alfei Yosef k'modorei Rav Ephraim Karo, that I, Yosef, ben Morenu Harav Ephraim Karo, the son of our Rabbi Ephraim Karo. Now the father of Maran is a unique personality. If you look here at footnote 30 Aviv, Rabbi Ephraim Karo, says Rabbi Shemtob Gaguine, his father, Rabbi Ephraim Karo, Haya Gam Ken Gadol B'Torah. He was also a giant in Torah. Uvno, and his son, Maran, Hevi B'Shmo Kama Halachot. He quotes him as a halachic source in a number of places. And he mentions here a few different places where Maran mentions his father. If you look at the last line, Hu maskir gam et dodo, Rabbi Yitzchak Karo. He also mentioned his teshuvot, and Even HaEzer, he mentioned his uncle, Rabbi Yitzchak Karo. So you have here a family of Talmidei Chachamim. Maran is not just he says he's a humble one among the people of Israel, but really he comes from an illustrious rabbinic family. Kineti la'Hashem Elohei Tzevaot. I have been zealous for the God of Israel. V'ni'arti chatzni l'sakel ha'mesila. And I wanted to pave the way for the Jewish people. I wanted to write a book which would explain all the laws of the Jewish people from their roots, from their origins, from the source and down. Ma'Gemara, from the Talmud, im chilukei svarat haposkim, with the various and different interpretations of the poskim of those Gemarot. V'ala b'dati, and initially I had intended l'somcho l'sefer harambam, to write my commentary on the book Mishneh Torah of the Rambam. Part of me wonders if Maran would have stuck to his original plan, how much more well received his Torah would have been than some of the more fringe elements of Sephardic Jewry. ולכן הסכמתי בדעתי לסמוך אותו על 4 טורים שחיבר הרי בן הראש, כי הוא כולל רוב דעות הפוסקים. He decided, for reasons he lists, instead of writing his commentary on the Rambam, to write his commentary on the Tur. The Tur is Rabbeinu Yaakov, the son of the Rosh. Who is the Rosh to Sfarad? Who is he? Say something positive before something negative.
I'm trying to figure out what's positive. What's negative? I mean, he moved to Spain with his father. His father was completely missed my mind, but he moved to Spain and he became a rabbi of the community there, and he was quite well respected. And
very good.
His father was the Tur, no?
The Tur is the son of the Rosh. So the Rosh comes along. He is probably, and I don't know if we have earlier precedents in history, I'm not an expert in all of Jewish history, but he's perhaps the first Ashkenazi rabbi to accept the pulpit in a Sephardic country. And the Rosh becomes a tremendous personality in Sepharad. Now, there are those who he is their rabbi, he is their teacher, he is their leader. So what if he is Ashkenazi? He's our rabbi. And there are those among the Sephardim who either, you can argue which came first, the chicken or the egg, who persecuted who first. But for whatever reason, the Rosh was not their rabbi. Many people have accused Moroccan Jews, for example, over the years of being Ashkenazified when Chabad came to Morocco, because there are certain minhagim that seem very similar to Ashkenazi customs. And the Moroccan Chachamim have already explained many times over that the Rosh was a serious force among the Jews of Spain. And the Jews of Spain ultimately ended up in Morocco. You have different Moroccan communities. You have the Megorashim, you have the Mista'arabim, you have the locals and the ones that come from Spain. Nonetheless, there is definitely a contingency of Sephardim whose rabbi and teacher is an Ashkenazi rabbi. And because of that, it shouldn't surprise you that 1,000 years later, you still find traces of certain Ashkenazi traditions inside of a Sephardic community. So the Rabbi Rabbeinu Yaakov, the son of the Rosh, he is an Ashkenazi Jew, born in a Sephardic community, or at least living his life in a Sephardic community, and he writes a book of halakha different than the Rambam. The Rambam, whose book of halakha is very clear and doesn't mention opinions, it simply tells a restatement of the oral law. The Tur tries to incorporate many other opinions of how you read the oral law into his Tur, and because of that, Maran says, "Hu kolel rov deot haposkim." The Tur's book contains in it many of the opinions of the poskim, and instead of having to deal with one opinion and elaborate on the rest, Maran felt that the Tur had already done a very good job at bringing many sources already. And as I was writing my commentary on the Tur, says Maran, I decided to rule halakha based on the 3 pillars of Jewish law. Ha'alfasi, that's Rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi of North Africa. Harambam, that's Rabbeinu Moshe ben Maimon also Sephardi, v'Harosh, and Rabbeinu Asher, who is the father of the two. So what does Maran do? He has these three pillars of halakha. And wherever the halakha is in agreement among all three, that's the halakha. When two go against one, halakha is like two. So he always goes with the majority. And there's some kind of interesting voting system that goes on here. And you can argue whether or not this is really a method of determining halakha, or is this just determining the consensus of halakha? There definitely is room for that. Is it legal analysis per se? Now what does Maran do? V'makom sheyesh chilukei deot benehem, and let's go to the next page. And any place where there is an argument among the three pillars of halakha, so Rambam says one thing, the Rif says one thing, the Rosh says another thing, they all disagree with each other, Naskim ledat shnayim ma'shlosha ele will either go based on 2 out of the 3. V'nifsok halakha k'motam. Sorry, this is meaning says Maran. He's always going to do 2 out of 3. Im lo shekol chachmei Yisrael o rubam cholkim anahem. And this is my rule. Unless the majority of the all of the sages of Israel, or the majority of the sages of Israel disagree with one of these opinions, in that case, I will go based on the numerous chachamim, even if they go against my 3 pillars of halakha. And that's why sometimes you'll find that Maran doesn't rule in any consistent fashion, because there are other opinions that Maran is also taking into consideration. And if there is a situation that arises in halakha where none of these rabbis shared an opinion, Nifsok kedivrei hachachamim hamefursamim acherim. I will rule based on the opinions of any of the other great chachamim that we're familiar with. Now look here at footnote 31. These are some of the rabbis that Maran uses inside of his book, the Shulchan Aruch, the Bet Yosef. 31. See footnote 31 at the bottom of the page? אלה שמות הספרים אשר תמך מרן יסודותיו בהלכה, שני התלמודים, so there are 2 Talmudim he bakes himself on. That's the Babylonian and the Jerusalem Talmud. Pirush Rashi, Tosfot, Harif, Harambam, Hasagot HaRavad, the critique of the Ravad on the Rambam, Harosh, Haran, Rabbeinu Nisim, Hamordechai, Magid Mishneh, Rabben Yerucham, Sefer HaTeumah, Shibbolei Leket, Rokeach, Sha'arei Dorah, Tashbetz, Rada. Who's Rada? Rabbi David? Aleph. Give me an Aleph. He codified many minhagim. Some say Abu Draham, some say Abu Dirham. Ha'itur, Nimukei Yosef, Hasmag, the Sefer Mitzvah Gadol, Orchot Chaim, Tshuvat Rashba, Torat HaBayit of the Rashba, Hagot Ashrei, Manhig, Egur, Balei Nefesh, Harivash, Mori Kolon, Tumat HaDeshen, Ulfamim Chokot, and in very rare instances, says Rabbi Shemtob Gaguine, Mevi B'Shem HaZohar, he quotes in the name of the Zohar things, and there are limited instances in which Maran quotes things from the Zohar. And there are some other ones. So what Maran does is he brings literally dozens and dozens of opinions that were not mentioned onto the commentary of the two. So he writes a Bet Yosef trying to give representation to as many Jewish opinions as he can possibly get his hand on. And this leads us to the introduction of his Shulchan Aruch. So back on the top of the page, He'etek Hagdamat Maran HaShulchan Aruch. So now I wish to copy for you the introduction of Maran himself to his Shulchan Aruch. So this is no longer in the Bet Yosef. This is the introduction to Maran and his Shulchan Aruch. Ra'iti b'libi. I saw it in my heart. Ki tov lidkot shoshanei amarav b'derech tzara b'shon tzach. That it's a good thing to make a summary of my book, Bet Yosef, which is a huge amount of work to study through. To take just the bottom line conclusions. He writes literally to pick the roses from my garden. So he's taking all the roses, meaning everything you need to know from the Bet Yosef. Leman tiyeh Torat Adonai temima shegura b'fi kol ish Yisrael. So the Torah of HaKadosh Baruch Hu can be memorized in the mouth of every Jewish person. Ki kasher yishalu letalmid chacham devar halacha, because when someone asks a talmid chacham a halacha, lo yigamgem ba, he won't start stuttering and mumbling and not know the answer in the halacha. By the way, there's a prohibition to not know the answer of a halacha. There's a famous Ran in Masechet Nedarim. Rabbeinu Nisim writes, "V'hagita bo yomam v'layla," that you must study Torah day and night. Why? For which purpose? So when you were asked a matter of halakha, shlei gamgem, you shouldn't start mumbling, stutter. No, we're not talking about someone who has a stutter. You shouldn't start hesitating. That's the right word, if I want to use a proper word. You shouldn't hesitate when answering a halakhic question. You should know the answer to a halakhic question, especially Talmid Chacham. By the way, Maran, the dot here that Rabbi Shemtob Gaguine is omitting, Maran says, and also every child should be able to know Shulchan Aruch by heart. So not just for rabbis, but for children, it should be taught in school to memorize the Shulchan Aruch, and then everybody will know halakha. Kach yeh barur lo kol din will be clear every halakha shishalu alav. When they ask this question, halakha l'maaseh biyoto shagur b'fiv hasefer hazeh. This rabbi, wherever he is, this child, wherever they are, they will be able to answer any halakhic question that comes to them. Of course I know the answer. It's written in Yoreh De'ah, it's written in HaShamayim, it's written in Even HaEzer. I know what it says in Choshen Mishpat. Everything I know. It's very easy. How do you study Shulchan Aruch by heart? How do you make that happen? Says Maran, I have a plan. Lechalko, lechalakim shloshim. I have written my Shulchan Aruch in 30 parts. Lilmod bo b'chol yom chelek. That way, every person can study one section of Shulchan Aruch every day. V'nimtza, and it turns out, shebekol chodesh hu chozer talmudo. That every month, you finish the entire Shulchan Aruch. And so if you finish the entire Shulchan Aruch every month, that means that every year you finish the Shulchan Aruch 12 times. So by the time you finish learning the Shulchan Aruch, which halakha do you not know? Everything is clear. Everything is known to you. Who here has studied Shulchan Aruch inside before?
One more time.
Have you studied Shulchan Aruch inside with Noseh Kelim?
Not the whole thing.
Not the whole thing. How long would it take you to study the whole thing? More or less than 30 days?
More, but he's not intending to do it with the Noseh Kelim. He's intending to read through it, just,
So here's what happens. Here's what happens. Maran writes a book to be complicated on the tool. And then he decides, let's keep it simple. I'm going to write just a summary of my whole book. And what happens is, nobody can leave Maran's summary alone. Everybody decides to write commentaries on the Shulchan Aruch. So now what you have, when you open up a Shulchan Aruch, you have 3 sentences from Maran, and paragraphs and paragraphs surrounding Maran's words. Those are called the Noseh Kelim, all the commentaries on the Shulchan Aruch. And ultimately, if one wanted to study Shulchan Aruch today, you would have to, 30 volumes. 30 volumes would be the size of your, and I can't even tell you the size of a book you'd have. Imagine every volume is the size of a Tanakh. Maran is talking about a little book he wrote, the Shulchan Aruch on its own. If you've seen Shulchan Aruch on its own, maybe whatever Chumash you have at home, that's the size of a Shulchan Aruch, printed in nice letters, big letters, just Maran. You could easily finish that book every month. By the way, I will tell you the truth. You don't have to study the whole Shulchan Aruch. But a person should make it, you can't make it a habit every day, at least once in your life. Take just the Shulchan Aruch, and study all of Orach Chaim, the first volume, all of it. Waking up in the morning, tefillah, washing your hands, food, holiday, Shabbat, all those things. And then if you feel brave, so take the next volume, Yoreh De'ah, and study through the halachot that are there. Shechita, you can skip, I don't know you're going to be doing shechita, but basar b'chalav, taruvot, kashrut, all the laws of immersing utensils in the mikveh, all the laws of bread and food cooked by non-Jews, taharat ha-mishpacha, the laws of nidah, the laws of mikvaot, the laws of tzedakah, the laws of giur, the laws of, you could finish. Those, forget the rest of Shulchan Aruch. Do 1.5 volumes of Shulchan Aruch, and you will know more halakha than most people that you know. Yes, more.
Well, so I've tried that. I remember a few years ago we put it on the group to do it. It's quite a long game. Would it not be better to do the Mishnah Torah? Do like a parak every day? What do you think?
So you can definitely do the Mishnah Torah as well. Like we, Maran is 95% the Rambam anyways. In my opinion, and I'm on camera, I'll be careful what I say. In my opinion, the Rambam's Mishnah Torah is more ordered, more clear than Maran Shulchan Aruch. Maran Shulchan Aruch sometimes uses words that you have to know something else in context to understand them. So it's difficult. Sometimes Maran can be cryptic, whereas the Rambam is very clear. I would say I would say this though. I will say that if you're going to study the Rambam that way, do me the same favor that I told you about Shulchan Aruch and skip half of the Mishneh Torah. Skip half of it. All the laws of Korbanot, all that. Do first, memorize by heart all of the Mishneh Torah that talks about the first 2 volumes of Mishneh Torah you want, maybe some of the last volumes. Know those ones well, and then come back later when you have a chance and review the rest of it. I mean, right now, it's not the purpose of knowing the whole code. It's at least knowing the parts of the code that are relevant to you. I'm not going to tell you not to study Mishneh Torah. But here, Maran Shulchan Aruch was intended for this. And I'll tell you just one benefit. One benefit is that when you study Maran, you can also study the Rama together. And this will help you very much in your day-to-day life. What the Rambam won't necessarily help you is when you live in a world that is mixed of Sephardim and Ashkenazim, and sometimes you have to explain yourself. Or sometimes you have to understand why they're not doing things the way you're doing them, or something else like that. In my experience, opening up Shulchan Aruch and showing that the Rama agrees with Maran has gone a much longer way than opening up a Mishneh Torah, which in the psyche of many Jewish communities, not mine, but many Jewish communities, we don't hold like the Rambam. Very easy to say that about Rambam, very hard to say that about the Shulchan Aruch with the Rama. Now, can you say it? For sure. You'll meet Jewish communities, all kinds of things. But in my opinion, sometimes this will help you in your interpersonal relationships in the Jewish community. I'm saying that kindly. Yeah. Umaran zacha, Maran merited lehadpis gam HaShulchan Aruch b'chayav b'kovetz katan. So Maran actually printed a volume of Shulchan Aruch in his life. If you look at footnote 32, mibli hagot Rama. So Maran's first edition of Shulchan Aruch obviously didn't have the notes of the Rama on them. He just gives you the years, different years of printings of Maran. Back on top. Leman Maran printed a small edition, so every Talmid Chacham could keep it in his pocket, keep it under his arm, and review halachot. And because of this, Maran made halacha accessible in one small volume to every Chacham, every Dayan, every Posek, every rabbi in the world was able to get their hands on a volume of Maran Shulchan Aruch, and like that, he acquired for himself a reputation among the Jewish people as the leader of halakha and the Jewish people. You should know, I'll just tell you that sometimes some of this is marketing. Putting out a book in a small format that people could carry around with them. Chacham Ovadia Yosef, alav shalom. I spent a lot of time trying to understand how his books, aside from their brilliance and their wisdom that is found in them, but why else had his books spread across the Sephardic community in ways that other chief rabbis, right before him or right after him, were not successful? And I only really understood this when I lived in Israel. I lived in Israel and I had to build my library there. And you go to the store, you want to buy yourself a set of Sfarim, you want to study the laws of Shabbat. I'll give you an example, laws of Shabbat. You go to the store, you have options, laws of Shabbat, this set, that set, the next set. Chacham Ovadia Yosef's books, at least when I was living in Israel, they don't cost you more than 30 shekels a volume. That's I don't know how much that comes out in pounds. Someone help me with the conversion. Benji, you're our resident Israeli here.
So 30 shekel now is about 8 pounds.
8 pounds. It's reasonable for a book?
Yeah.
Yeah, of course. A hardcover book with nice print and nice paper. If you go to the store, you want to buy another set in Hilchot Shabbat, you can end up spending 3 times that amount on another set. You want to go buy Sheilot V'Tshuvot, a question and answers responsa. You're going to go buy a set, it's going to cost you hundreds and hundreds of shekalim. Chacham Yosef, you could buy it for 200 shekels. Was able to bring the books to Talmidei Chachamim at a rate that they could afford in books that they wanted to study from. And ultimately, this gained him a reputation that many people, young Talmidei Chachamim especially, were able to afford his books. They were not hard to find, they were available in every store, they were very, very cheap. Maran was able to conquer the Sephardic world at least, later the rest of the Jewish world, in a similar way. He made his book useful, accessible, and everyone needed it. Sifra Bet Yosef, his book, the Bet Yosef, היה היסוד ואבן פינה להוראה ומקור נפתח אל בירורי טעמי הלכה. Maran's Bet Yosef became the go-to book for understanding the sources and the evolution of halakha from the Talmud until where we are today. You open up a Talmud. You want to say, how do we get from this teaching all the way to what we do today? Maran's Bet Yosef is going to help you. You want to read the Rambam and understand how we got from halakha, Maran's Kesef Mishneh will help you. You look at the tool. You want to understand how the halakha got, you look at the Bet Yosef, Maran will help you. You want to understand the bottom line of the halakha, look at the Shulchan Aruch, Maran will help you. Maran gained for himself a reputation as the go-to person, the address that you want to have whenever it comes to Psikat Halakha. Nimtza, and it comes out, Ki b'chayei Maran u'v'dorot harishonim achei moto, that in his lifetime and in the generations immediately after his death, haya shmo gadol v'ne'eratz b'fei kol ish Yisrael. That his name was admired in the mouth of every Jewish person. V'haya l'Rabban shel kol b'nei hagola. And he was the rabbi of pretty much all the Jews in the world. Now, obviously, Rabbi Shemtob Gaguine is being very flowery. When he say the rabbi of all the Jews in the world, it doesn't mean the only authority, the only rabbi. It means a personality that everybody was learning his books, whether they argued with them or they agreed with them, but he now became someone that they studied. There are many titles they give rabbis, and you open up books and you see a rabbi's title. This one is Harav, this one is Harav HaGaon, this was Maran Harav HaGaon, this one is, everyone, normally the less important the rabbi is, the greater amount of titles they give the rabbi before his name. You have to compensate for what he's not. And you sometimes, I remember seeing a book, it said the rabbi's name, right before the rabbi's name, they wrote Rash Kabahag, the acronym, Rash Kabahag. What does it mean, Rash Kabahag? Do you know this acronym? Have you heard it before? So you just read it now. Look, Rabban Shel Kol Bnei Hagolah, the rabbi of the whole Jewish people. Now I'm opening up this book. It says Rabbi so and so Rash Kabahag, and I say to myself, if I wasn't in this Judaica store right now, I probably would never have heard of this rabbi's name. I mean, he's a rabbi of some little yeshiva in Bnei Brak. I appreciate it very much. I know that you think your rabbi is the best rabbi, but I promise you that nobody else aside from you has heard of him. Why would you title someone's name Rash Kabahag? It's almost embarrassing. We didn't even hear of him, let alone that he's our rabbi. There are though Chachamim, certain Chachamim, that you can say about them Rash Kabahag. The Rambam, you could definitely say, which Bet Midrash in the world doesn't have the writings of the Rambam? Which Bet Midrash doesn't have a copy of Shulchan Aruch? Those are rabbis that you could say about them, Rabban Shel Kol Bnei Hagolah. ולמען היום אשר פרס רבנו משה איסר דין את המפה על השולחן ערוך, and from that day where Rama spread his tablecloth, his commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, היה השולחן ליתד התקוע על ההוראה הלכה למעשה, this became the book of halakha, practical halakha, וכמה גאוני עולם, גדולי halakha, עשו לו מסגרת סביב פירושים וחידושים אין מספר. And how many giants of halakha chose to adorn the Shulchan Aruch with the commentary of the Rama with their own ornaments, with their own commentaries on the page of the Shulchan Aruch. Let's talk very briefly for a moment how it works. Rama is a rabbi in Krakow, Poland. Why is a rabbi in Krakow writing a commentary on a Sephardic work of halakha that is coming out of Israel? What's the story? Who was in my class about Maran? Or my Pesach class maybe?
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, why does Rama, an Ashkenazi rabbi, involve himself so much with a book of a Sephardic rabbi, the Shulchan Aruch?
Well, he wasn't really.
Rabbi Benji,
They had the Shulchan Aruch at the same time.
Well, I wasn't in the Rav Shir, but what I understand from Hakdama to Darkei Moshe is that he was working on the same project without realizing.
Mm-hmm.
And in his Anava, Basof, he realized he's not going to write a competing book. He will add his notes where he feels that Ashkenazi halacha differs.
This is very important. Thank you, Rabbi Benji. This one is very important. This story here is that Rama is writing, two people are working on the opposite sides of the world. They're working on the same project. How do we get a simplified code of halakha to the Jewish people? The Rama is working for about 10 years on this project. A few months before he brings his book to print, you have to remember this is not Microsoft Word documents, this is writing by hand. There's no Bar Ilan responsive project, there's no Safaria, there's no Google, you have to do all of this work by hand. You have to know all of this Torah. To write a summary of the halakha, you have to know halakha in a non-normal way. The Rama is just about to publish his book, and some Sephardic rabbi from Tzfat puts out a Shulchan Aruch. In today's Judaism, All that would happen is the rabbi in Poland would put out a notice to his community. It's forbidden to study the heretical teachings of the rabbi from there. They make a pashkavil, they go around, they burn the books, they ban the books, whatever is going to happen. And Rabbi Israelish wins the show when his students study his Shulchan Aruch. It's not what he does. Benji mentions the anava, his humility. The Rama says, how could I make the Jewish people separated by studying two different books of halakha? I am going to bury my book. Lignos, he buried his book. And he began writing a brand new commentary on the Shulchan Aruch. And if Maran Shulchan Aruch means a set table, the Rama says, I'm putting the tablecloth on the table. That's my contribution. And the Rama essentially is responsible for uniting the Jewish people around the Shulchan Aruch. Had the Rama not been the better man, today you'd have two books of halakha, one for Sephardim, one for Ashkenazim, and I wouldn't be able to say, well, which Bet Midrash doesn't have a Shulchan Aruch? Today, every Bet Midrash has a Shulchan Aruch with the Rama's commentary, and that's due to the great humility of the Rama. There's a letter between the Rama and Maran, where Rama calls Maran Nasi Elohim Betochenu. You are the Prince of God in our midst. The Rama says, "V'kol hacholek alav." Anyone who argues with Maran, kicholek al Shechina, is like he's arguing with Hakadosh Baruch Hu himself. Now you have to then explain why Rama argues with Maran, but that's what the Rama says towards Maran. And there's an interesting book. Some of you might have it in your home. There's a Kitzur Shulchan Aruch with the notes. Kitzur Shulchan Aruch was written by who? Who was the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch? The first one, not the. There's many today. The original. Very good. Rav Shlomo Gansfried. Rav Shlomo Gansfried was a Hungarian rabbi, very special to Micham. I think it was a mistake in the Jewish world that became the book that everybody studied. I'm not saying anything derogatory about it, but it's made many people think of halakha in a way that they don't necessarily need to. Rav Shlomo Gansfried, by the way, I just got a copy last week. In my hands, finally, I got a copy on his commentary on the Torah. He has a very short commentary, Apirion, on the Torah. I finally found it in a used bookstore somewhere. They sent it to me, and it never came. It never came. It got lost in the United States Postal Service somewhere in some bag. They said, forget it. They wanted to refund me the money. And then just before Shabbat, the postal worker shows up. Here's an envelope for you. And inside was the writing of Rabbi Shlomo Gansfried on the Parashat Shavua. I was so grateful to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. I said, my fear was I lost the book. So not only would I not have it, but you can't buy this book. It's not available in the store anywhere. And I was so sad. Like, of all the books to lose, why did it have to be the one I can't find anywhere? And Baruch Hashem gave that gift to me. Mamash, right before Shabbat. I brought it to the Bet Knesset here on Shabbat, and I was able to study from it. Rabbi Shlomo Gansfried, his book has become very popular in Jewish day schools, in many places where they teach halakha. And Mordechai Eliyahu felt that in Israel, it wasn't representative of Sephardic teachings. So he thought that he should write a book for Sephardic students to study in school. And so he spent a number of years writing a book called the Kisur Ben Ish Chai. As you know, Mordechai Eliyahu was very close with the teachings of the Ben Ish Chai. And so he wanted to write an abridged version of the Ben Ish Chai. Probably omitting the Kabbalah and all those things, just halachot for the students in modern Hebrew. And he said he realized that if he would publish this book, then now Jewish day schools would have this dilemma. Ashkenazi kids are studying Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, Sephardic kids are studying Kitzur Ben Ish Chai. He said instead, he put away that book, and he said in the spirit of the Rama, he's writing a commentary on the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch with Sephardic teachings. So whenever Sephardic teachings disagree with what's written in the Kitzur, he makes a footnote. And this way, you have a Kitzur Shulchan Aruch that has on it the notes both of an Ashkenazi rabbi and a Sephardic rabbi. I found that to be inspiring story that even Chachamim of our generation were able to think like this. In order to understand the reason, to understand why the Rama feels, if he feels so strongly about Maran, why does he feel the need to write notes on the Shulchan Aruch? Why not just leave the Shulchan Aruch the way it is? It's important for me to quote to you a little bit from his introduction, the Rama's introduction to Shulchan Aruch. And he has a beautiful footnote here, 33. See footnote 33? It says Rabbi Shemtob Gaguine, Tamid hayiti tameh. I was always wondering, Madua hamadpisim hishmitu ma Shulchan Aruch ha'akdamot shel Maran u'Moram. Why did all of the publishers of Shulchan Aruch, today not included, so the early, why did all of them omit the introductions of Maran and the Rama to Shulchan Aruch? If you look in old Shulchan Aruch, you won't find Maran's introduction to the book. You won't find the Rama's introduction to the book. They're not printed there. ולא חיכו להדרך הישרה של מדפיסי ונציה ואמסטרדם, שתמיד היו חוזרים ומדפיסים אלו ההקדמות, וגם הקדמת הבר גולה השמיטוה. He says that they should have imitated the printers of Venezia and Amsterdam, that they always printed the introductions of Maran and Rama and also the Be'er HaGolan. I have a set of Shulchan Aruch in the other Beit Knesset here. It's an old one, printed in New York, probably in the 40s or the 50s. And there they really took these words to heart. And every single volume of Shulchan Aruch, no matter which volume it is, they have the introduction of Maran and Rama. So you take out volume number 12, it's like you're starting the book all over again. They have the introduction printed all over, but it's important. Says the Rama, Hagaon HaMechaber Bet Yosef Shulchan Aruch, the genius, the author of the Bet Yosef and the Shulchan Aruch, Shelo lo hiniach makom litgader bo. He didn't leave me any room to add to him, meaning he did a terrific job, a thorough job. I only needed to collect some of the later teachings that he didn't mention. And I felt the need to show the customs that we Jews in these countries, Ashkenazi Jews, we're accustomed to. I came after him, to spread a tablecloth over the set table that Maran has prepared. ועליה כל פרי מגדים וטעמים אשר יאהב האדם on the top of the next page. And I wish to add all kinds of delicious things that people like to eat them. ולא זה השולחן אשר הוא ערוך לפני אדוני, and this is the table which will be set before Hashem. ולא נתנו עדיין לבני אדם אשר במדינות אלה אשר רובי מנהגי מדינות אלה לא נהגינן כבתי. So then the problem that we Ashkenazi Jews have with the Shulchan Aruch is that there are so many things that are written in the Shulchan Aruch that we Ashkenazi Jews don't follow. We're not accustomed to following the ways of Maran. And therefore this book has become irrelevant to us. Ki kvar amur rabotenu zal, our rabbis already taught us, en lemendim min haklalot. We don't learn anything from general rules. Afilu b'makom shneimar b'chutz, even in particular cases. כל שכן מן הכלל שכלל הגאון מעצמו לפסוק אחרי הריף והרמב"ם במקום שרובי האחרונים חולקים עליהם. That especially if the rabbis tell us we don't rely blindly on set rules, then how much more so a rule that Maran himself invented to rule like the Rif and the Rambam. ועל ידי זה נתפשטו בספריו הרבה דברים שאינם עדים בדין. And because of this methodology of Maran, there are many things that are written in his books that are not halachic for us. לפי דברי החכמים שמהם אנו שותים, based on the writings of the Chachamim that we drink their waters. והם הפוסקים בבני אשכנז, and they are the leaders of the Ashkenazi Jews. ואני ראיתי כל דבריו בשולחן ערוך כנתנו משה מפי הגבורה. And it seems that Maran, when he writes a Shulchan Aruch, he thinks that all of his words were given by Moshe Rabbeinu on Mount Sinai. ויבוא התלמידים אחריו וישתו דבריו בלי מחלוקת. And he expected the students to come afterwards and to drink his words thirstily without arguing with him. ובזה יסתרו כל מנהגי המדינות. And if we allow the Shulchan Aruch to take over, then all of the minhagim of the Ashkenazim will be decimated. על כן, therefore, ראיתי לכתוב דעת אחרונים אם המקום שלא היו נראים לי דבריו בצידו. And I therefore decided to write my commentary, to show wherever we disagree, wherever our Ashkenazi rabbis disagree with what he writes in the Shulchan Aruch. Now later, Rabbi Shemtob Gaguine will accuse Rama of undermining the unity project of Maran. And later he will accuse him of that. I don't want to do that right now. But the Rama serves a practical purpose. Because he wants people, when they study Shulchan Aruch, to know what Ashkenazi Jews do as well, he spread his commentary on the Shulchan Aruch. Now finally Rabbi Shemtob Gaguine is going to talk. V'ani ha'eved, and I, the servant of these great rabbis. Tameh al devrei harama, I'm bewildered by the words of the Rama. Ma shekatav al Maran shekalal ma'atzmo lifsok ha'rif ha'rambam. He says that the Maran made a rule on his own to rule according to the Rif and the Rambam. By the way, I just want to let you know, this rule is not Maran's invention. In my class, in the Chavurah, I showed you that this methodology of choosing 2 out of 3 already existed before Maran, and it could be that was the motivator that got Maran to adopt this method in the first place. Why does he neglect to mention that Maran intentionally incorporated an Ashkenazi rabbi into the mix, the Rosh? שאם שניהם מאלו מסכימים לדעה אחת, נפסוק הלכה כמותם כמו שכתב בבית יוסף. That Maran will even rule against the Rambam sometimes if the Rosh and the Rif agree with each other. וידוע לכל פוסק גדולתו וקדושתו של הראש. And every posek knows about the greatness and the holiness of the rosh. I'm putting aside now anything written in anti-Maimonidean demons, anything to do with what happened there in the political side. Here I'm talking on a halachic level. אשר הוא היה ארי שבחבורה, he was the lion of his colleagues. וכל רבני אשכנז וספרד סומכים על הוראותיו, and Ashkenazi and Sephardic rabbis feel comfortable relying on his opinions. ואחרי מות הרשב"א, and after the death of the Rashba, נשאר הראש יחיד בדורו בספרד. The Rosh was left the only one like him in Spain. ולישיבתו הגדולה אשר יסד בתולדה נהרו תלמידים מכל קצווי הארץ. And in his great yeshiva in Toledo, all of these Jews, students from all over the world came to study. ועוד במה שהתרעם שרוב האחרונים חולקים עליהם. הלא מרן כבר כתב שם, אם לא בקצת מקומות שכל חכמי ישראל רובם חולקים על הדעה הוא, ולכן פשט מנהג להפך. He said, you're upset, Rama, that sometimes Maran, there are things that the customs disagree with. He said, Maran already mentioned in his introduction that there are times where he takes other opinions into consideration if the other rabbis of the Jewish people disagree with these three. ואם בקצת ארצות נהגו איסור, אף על פי שאנו נכריע בהפך, יחזיקו במנהגם. Says Maran that if there are instances where I write something that's prohibited, I write something that's permitted, and in their countries there was a minhag to prohibit something, אף על פי כן יחזיקו במנהגם, כי כבר קיבלו עליהם דברי החכם האוסר, ואסור להם לנהוג יותר. I leave room for those who have a different opinion, says Maran. I'm not trying to get you to change your opinion. ובזה שר הפחד של הרמה במה שכתב על ידי נתפסו בספריו. He says, and therefore the Rama can rest assured that even Maran was not trying to decimate your minhagim. Now he takes issue with the Rama. The Rama said that Maran saw himself as if he was Moshe Rabbeinu on Mount Sinai. וחלילה לומר על Maran. And how dare you say about Maran? God forbid you should say about him. שכל פסקיו בשולחן ערוך חשבם כנתנה משה מפי הגבורה. That he thought that everything that he writes in שולחן ערוך, you should treat like Moshe Rabbeinu gave it on Mount Sinai. כי בפירוש כתב בהקדמת בית יוסף, שעלה בראשונה בדעתו לסומכו לספר הרמב"ם, אבל בראותו כפסקיו כגוזר ואומר, הסכים לסומכו לספר התורים, כי הוא כולל רוב דעות הפוסקים. Maran already said, I wanted to write my commentary on the Rambam, but because I saw that the Rambam simply rules halachot and doesn't give you other opinions, I decided to go to the Tur, which is a book that contains many opinions. Says the Rabbi Shemtob Gaguine to the Rama, how dare you say Maran is trying to make it sound like his opinion is the only one? Maran avoided writing a commentary on the Rambam because he felt the Rambam had neglected to mention opinions other than his own. And when I say Rambam's other opinions other than his own, meaning the law as understood by the Rambam, and not the way understood by other people. And therefore he went to the tool to incorporate other minhagim. If you want to look up a fun kliyakav, if you look in Shmot, Perek Lamed Gimel, Pasuk Yud Bet, the kliyakav uses this word of gozer ve'omer, this phrase. That HaKadosh Baruch Hu, he is gozer ve'omer. He says something and you have to accept my opinion. Maran didn't act that way. Maran didn't rule things that you have to accept what I say. That wasn't Maran. Why would you accuse Maran of such a thing? V'chadashot ani magid. So now I'm saying now something new. And the truth is that I'm not familiar enough with the history behind what he's writing here. In my edition of the Tshuvot Mo'aribal that he quotes here, I couldn't find this Teshuvah in the right place. The Chadashot ani magid, and I'm telling you something new, says Rabbi Shemtob Gaguine. כשמרן חיבר השולחן ערוך, that when Maran wrote the Shulchan Aruch, כלל בו גם מנהגי קהילות רומניה הקדומים בעיר קושטא. He also included the Romanian minhagim that were found in Kushta. In Kushta is Turkey, yeah. המיוסדים על פי מנהג אשכנז וצרפת, which are based off of the Ashkenazi, French and German customs. ולא על פי חכמי תולדותיה שבספרד, and not on the Spanish חכמים. ואם כל זה נמשכו הספרדים אחריהם, and the Sephardim also acted in accordance with some of these Ashkenazi rulings. I mean, Maran included not just the Ashkenazi rulings of the Rosh, but there are other instances where Maran includes Ashkenazi opinions in order to balance out the halachic picture that he's presenting. But don't get too upset at the Rama. Anybody who has eyes and vision will see כי לא הרמה היה הראשון לחלוק על מרן, אלא אשר פשר לעניין ההוראה ללכת אחרי הריף הרמב"ם והראש. That it wasn't only the Rama who didn't feel comfortable with Maran's decision to rule only according to these three rabbis. In my shiur in the UK, I think I spent an entire session on those who opposed the Shulchan Aruch, those who didn't want the Shulchan Aruch. There definitely was a trend like that. There were Sephardic, but I'm mistaken. Maribal here, this teshuvah I do have. I quoted it for you in my class there. It's a different book that I'm referring to. In the teshuvot of the Maribal, he, maybe if I recall, didn't even allow the Bet Yosef inside of his Bet Midrash. They didn't want it there. כי גם בימי הרמה יצא גם מורנו הרב שלמה לוריה נגד מרן ודבריו ידועים. The Marshal, he argued against Maran. He said some pretty bad things, I don't want to say it. וגם על הטור עצמו חרה פה. He was also livid at the Tur himself וכתב כי מה לא שהסכים עם אביו הראש. So what if the Tur agrees with his father the ראש? אנו לא מסכימים עמו בדבר הלכה. The next top of the next page. It's nice that you like your father. We don't like your father. We didn't agree with him. The Marshal was very sharp in his opposition towards codifying Jewish law in books. וכן הוא בכמה מקומות באיסור והיתר דלא נגיד כ"ט. There are many places in Halakha where we don't agree with your father the ראש. ועיין בתשובות מורשך. This is the book that I was telling you. מורשך, I couldn't find them. My editions, I couldn't find this תשובה. שכתב, he wrote, שרבים תפסו עליו ונחלקו עמו פנים בפנים. That many people argued with Maran, even face to face. By the way, who is this Shach? This is not the Shach on the Shulchan Aruch. This is a Mor Shach. Have you heard of Rabbi Shlomo HaKohen before? You should look him up afterwards. Rabbi Shlomo HaKohen, he lived in Greece in the year 1540 to 1602. So that makes him 62 years old. And he was one of the great Chachamim in Yavan, in Greece at the time. Vayen HaShla, look in the writings of the Shla. שראה תשובה בכתב יד הרב קסטליץ שהיה בדור מרן אשר מפיו לפידים יהלוכו. Look at the Shla. I don't have a copy of the Shla in my home, so I wasn't able to look this up myself. Okay, one day we'll have. The Shla quotes a Mahari Kastelitz. He said he spoke words about Maran like fire was coming out of his mouth. Rockets were coming out of his mouth. אבל הרדב"ז בתשובה כתב כל הגלילות הללו קיבלו עליהם הרי"ב והרמב"ם והראש להיות הכרעתם הכרעה בין להקל ולהחמיר בנפטור בין לחיוב. But the Radbaz writes that in his time everybody accepted this rule of ruling based on these three Amudei HaHora'ah. And again, like I told you, so it's not Maran inventing something, but this is something that existed already. My last sentence here for today. וכתב הגאון חידה, and Rabbi Chaim Yosef David Azulai already wrote, Ata emet agid, I will tell you the truth. Asher shamati mipum rabbanan kadishai, I heard in the names of great rabbis. Now, in my edition of the Chida, I'm almost positive, and I don't know by heart, if you have my Maran source sheets that should say there, I'm almost positive that this word here is kshishai, from the elder rabbis. But here, Rabbi Shemtob Gaguine says kadishai, the holy rabbis. I don't know. You have to look at the version. I'm assuming by heart. Bepi harav hagaon mofet ador, from the great rabbi of our generation, Morenu harav Chaim Abulafia. I spoke about him at length in my Chavurah class. Shekibel miziknei geonei hador, that he received the tradition from the elders of the generation. Sheskimu ze karov lematayim rabbanim midoro, that 200 rabbis of his generation agreed to the rulings of Maran the Shulchan Aruch. V'kach haya omer, and he said, ki kol echad yaseh kipsak Maran, that anyone who follows the rulings of Maran, avid kimatan rabbanan elu hem devarav, and they are following the words of 200 rabbis. When you follow Shulchan Aruch, you're ruling in accordance with 200 chachamim. Some say that's even why Maran is called Maran. Maran doesn't mean our master, but Maran stands for Matayim Rabbanim Nismach. He was agreed upon by 200 other chachamim. V'kach katav haGaon Mehorit Al-Gazi, and Rabbeinu Yom Tov Al-Gazi writes a similar thing in his book Simchat Yom Tov. This is the end of my summary. Next week we're going to be doing something entirely different, but we needed this in order to understand what Rabbi Shemtob Gaguine is going to do in the couple of months ahead. Rabbi Shemtob Gaguine is going to present us with a list of things that Sephardim and Ashkenazim do differently. And then afterwards, and this is later on this summer, Rabbi Shemtob Gaguine is going to present to us some 30 or 40 places in which he believes that the Ashkenazi opinions of halakha don't violate just the Shulchan Aruch, but they violate the actual law as proposed by the Talmud, and he's part of a larger picture that Rabbi Shemtob Gaguine is trying to paint for us together. But as much as we may have studied together about Maran and the Rama, it was important for me to review this background today, because we will not be able to understand what the big deal is in the coming weeks unless we truly understand the story of Maran and the Rama and the Shulchan Aruch. And I'll tell you this, that in the world that we live in today, even if Sephardim were to follow Maran and Ashkenazim were to follow the Rama, we would be almost identical. Almost identical. The Rama doesn't argue with Maran everywhere. And even when he does, it's not always an argument. Sometimes it's an embellishment, it's an elaboration of a point. What has happened since this generation is not that Sephardim follow Maran, Ashkenazim follow the Rama. There have been hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of opinions that have come afterwards. And I would tell you to the point that even Ashkenazim don't follow the Rama. Maran, Sephardim follow him, but Ashkenazim, I don't know that they follow the Rama. In our Bet Midrash, by Harav Peretz always told us that we give preference to the Rama. So we study Shulchan Aruch for Sephardim. When an Ashkenazi Jew asks us a halachic question, the Rama is the opinion we share with them. What about all the 100 other Ashkenazi opinions? So he mentioned what Ramord mentioned before about anava, humility that Rama had. The fact that Rama was one who was trying to unite the Jewish people. And we give him great respect. He, for us, is considered the end of the line for Ashkenazim when we rule halakha for them. There was an opportunity, and the opportunity was for Maran to unite the Jewish people. I still believe this is something that could happen. But I know how much farther away we are from this than we were hundreds of years ago. Nonetheless, Maran and the Rama together, this book of the Shulchan Aruch, together with both of their opinions, does contain inside of it much of the secret, much of the answer to how we can unite the Jewish people. Though one might argue that this type of unity is unity through conformity. So you're asking me to abandon things that are important to me, traditions that are important to me, to sign up onto a book that's called the Shulchan Aruch. Why should I do that? Why should I conform to your understanding of Jewish law? Now, that's a really good question. It's a really good question. And at this point in our shiur, I want to end off with the following thought. And I think that question, it comes from a place that is important, it's real. I'm validating that complaint. It also comes along with a lot of arrogance. It's the arrogance of why should I have to change in order to make peace in the Jewish people? And this attitude, you're right. We can always be ideologues and hold our ground and put our stick in the mud and we're not going to cross this line and we'll never cross over to your side. And that's what the Jewish people have been doing for 2,000 years. And that's why we spent the last 2 months discussing all of these different instances where there were Samaritans and there were Karaites and there were Perushim and there were all the different the Hasidim and the Mitnagdim, and everybody in the Jewish people always has to be right. And because they always have to be right, no one is willing to become one. So then at the very least say, you know what? I'm not willing to conform. You know why I don't want to conform? Because I don't really believe in unity. Well, if I don't really believe in unity, well then the introduction of Rabbi Shemtob Gaguine is useless. Because the introduction of Rabbi Shemtob Gaguine is predicated on the fact that we see Jewish unity as a value. And even if that means that we're all going to have to give something up in order to be able to eat with each other again, and pray with each other again, and marry each other again, and go to the same schools again, and go to the same synagogues again. In order to do that, we'll each have to sacrifice something? Fine, call it conformity. Use that negative word. But the goal at the end will be unity. What we'll get out of it will be something that is powerful. And I think that we live in a Jewish world where so many people just want to be right. Nobody wants to give in. Nobody wants to budge. Nobody wants to compromise. Maran, as I presented to you then, Maran is a man who believes that compromise is the right way to bring peace. Who knows? I once saw an Ashkenazi Talmid Chacham write that when we take 3 steps back at the end of the Amidah, what verse do we say? Which pasuk do we say? Prayer we say. We say, Oseh shalom b'romav, hu b'chamav yaseh shalom alenu, v'al kol amo Yisrael v'imo amen. He who makes peace in Shamayim should make peace down below, and all the Jewish people, amen. And he said, it's something very interesting. That in order to make peace, Jewish tradition has us take 3 steps back. There's something to be said that if you want to have peace in the world, you sometimes have to be willing to take a step back from your stance. You can't always stand your ground and expect that the whole world will be peaceful. There's a flip side of this. The flip side of this is, what about the truth? What about emet? Do we just give in for peace? What about the truth? And one day you and I will sit down and have a conversation about the never-ending war between the 2 values of emet and shalom. There's a famous midrash about HaKadosh Baruch Hu creating the world. And he wanted to create the world, and he consulted with the word emet, and emet didn't want it. He consulted with shalom, shalom wanted it. There was an argument over there. The Kotzker Rebbe ended up saying, there's a commentary there in that midrash, the Kotzker Rebbe, Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Kotzk, he said, anywhere where you have shalom, you don't have emet. Anywhere where you have peace, there's no truth. Because you have to be deceitful to have peace. He was very negative about this attitude of peace. And he said, wherever you have peace, you definitely don't have truth. And I don't know that you have to summarize the world in that way. The Prophet tells us, "V'ha'emet v'hashalom ehavu," that ultimately the Jewish people will learn to love, not get along, will learn to love these values of emet and shalom. There is a way to bring about a compromise that is also truthful and a truth that is also peaceful. B'ezrat Hashem, Rabbi Shemtob Gaguine will guide us in the coming weeks to that path, but first he has to present the problem, and we'll be doing that together in the coming weeks. B'ezrat Hashem. Thank you so much for learning with me tonight.